All right. Hello. Welcome to the next episode of the Untrodden podcast. Today I'm joined by Derick Varn, who obviously has his own show, Varn Vlog, interviews a lot of different people, does his own solo content, and, writer, just thinker on the left. And so I wanted to have him on and talk about, Marxism broadly, philosophy, online politics, and liberalism, I guess, and contemporary politics in general. So yeah, the first thing I wanted to ask you about is I've been reading a lot of Hegel. I've been very interested in Hegel. And from what I understand, you have kind of a mixed relationship to Hegel. Like on one hand, you appreciate his importance and what he's offering, but I think you have more of a mixed opinion overall. So what is that? What is your opinion on Hegel? How do you interact with Hegel? Yeah.
I mean, Hegel's whole project, in a way, is a response to the English empiricist critique of rationalism and also developments out of German thinking and the German idealist school, of which he is the most famous member. Um, the one thing that you have to understand, I think, to understand Hegel is that Hegel thinks the idea is both negative but absolutely real, and this is grounded in a theological preposition. It may not be standard Christianity, but attempts to read him as a modern atheist, I think, are totally anachronistic. His left wing flank, from Feuerbach to Marx, did not read him that way. Um, they thought he was pretty sincere about his religious beliefs. And while I would say he would definitely, even by most Orthodox Lutheran standards in America, that'd be like Missouri Synod or whatever, he would probably be a heretic. He did mean what he said about theology and about theology manifesting through the development of ideas in history. So God works through the unhappy consciousness, which creates a striving for freedom, which in and of itself creates opposing movements that negate and transcend each other. And these movements, as intellectual developments in the human history, drive historical development. Um, I think if you just read the phenomenology, or even if you just read the science of logic, which I think is a more important work, actually, um, you won't get all that. You have to read the lectures on religion. You have to of the history of religion. You have to read his notebooks. Um, that said, I mean, like I am convinced by McGee's argument that there's a little bit of hermeticism in Hegel's methodology. That there's some what we might call like early modern mysticism in Hegel's methodology. I do not think you have to accept Hegel's religious and mystical prepositions to get something out of what he's
Mm.
doing with the movement of ideas in history. So I don't see the need to cast him out. And in fact, my central proposition is European philosophy really is after Hegel a response to either Hegel or Kant. So the division between analytic and continental philosophy is the 20th century division. For example, many people that we would consider proto-analytic philosophers like Charles Sanders, uh, Peirce, are the various other pragmatists, uh, were highly influenced by Hegel,
Mm.
as were more mystical thinkers like Emerson in the United States. Um, Unfortunately or fortunately, most people who are Hegelians actually interpret Hegel through Marx.
Mm.
They tend to secularize Hegel and render him safer for a modern consciousness, and also get rid of a lot of the more problematic post Hegel developments around Schiller, around Fichte, and a lot of the other uh, German, what we might call right wing socialists, but they're not. I don't mean that by Nazis. That's anachronistic, but let's say socially conservative statist socialist, um, and also the way in which Continental philosophy is also a reaction to Hegelian thought in existentialism and post structuralism and structuralism. They're all reactions to various forms of Hegelianism. Structuralism and post structuralism come out of Hegelian readings in anthropology via Claude Levi Strauss, et cetera, et cetera. I One of the things I find very frustrating is with the exception of the work of Friedrich Besser, who I really think is a good intellectual historian on these topics. Hegel is presented in a decontextualized manner today, partly in response to the anti-Hegelianism of the 1960s, 70s, and 80s in American academia and the humanities that came out of the John Hopkins post-structuralism conferences that led to quote unquote postmodernism, a category that I don't even really think is totally valid. I've talked about this before. I don't think postmodernism is a totally coherent category in philosophy.
Right.
Um, but post structuralism is, and that's what most people mean by postmodernism. So maybe we can just like go from that. And that was a deeply anti Hegelian, deeply anti analytic movement, largely based in Heidegger's readings of Hegel, as interpreted through Derrida and Paul de Man and stuff like that. Um, Foucault, Foucault's reappropriation of Althusser's structuralism, and then rejection of that, and also rejection of Hegel. Foucault's rejection of Kajeve's reading of Hegel. For those you don't know, Kajeve was an early 20th century French thinker who a lot of our misunderstandings of Hegel actually come from the French lectures by Kajeve on Hegel in the early 20th century. Lacan got his version of Hegel from that. Althusser did too. So knowing this kind of like lipstick trace history of academic reception history makes understanding how we got here with Hegel a lot easier. Um, what I like about Hegel, though, is despite my talking about this metaphysical proposition and this idea, I mean, he believes ideas are real in a substantive sense. Um, uh, is that freedom for Hegel is a freedom of movement that has to be developed over time. So, like, the clarification of what freedom is does have to move through a historical process. Um, Now, this makes dialectics so in Hegelian dialectics kind of confusing because most people, and when Marxists say dialectics, um, a lot of times they're like interpreting it through Mao's interpretation of Marx and Engels, who was simplifying it for a peasant audience who mostly understood Taoism. Like, and they're reappropriating that
Yeah.
and they're really stripping it out. So it basically means a synthesis of opposites or some shit like that that like most people can't even make heads or tails of what it means. And sometimes you just dialectical becomes a weasel word.
Mm.
So to understand what Hegel and Kant and the German idealists are doing, you do have to understand what dialectics historically was and understanding dialectical philosophy as opposed to what we might call pre-modern analytics, which is analysis of arguments and polemics and stuff like that. So if you go back to Aristotle and the Aristotelian categories, dialectics is what happens when the debate cannot define its terms. So the terms are defined through debate itself. And this way of doing philosophy in traditional philosophical schools is not unique to Greco Roman philosophy. You see dialectics in Dharmic philosophy in India, you see dialectics in the Sino Tibetan tradition, you even see something like dialectics in the Confucian and Taoist tradition, which is that when you do not understand what a term means, the way to hash that out is oppositional dialogue. Um, what the German historicists do, since they take these ideas as real and they take these dialogues as being about something more substantive than just ephemeral human ideas that are emergent in human consciousness, um, they try to argue, and I think in some ways, interestingly and maybe even effectively, that history plays out these ideas because these ideas are real. They are coming from the absolute idea. The absolute idea is a negative force in history that creates the unhappy consciousness. This is Hegel, and there's other versions of this, but the negative force in history that creates an unhappy consciousness. That unhappy consciousness and that struggling against things actually is getting you closer to God.
Mm.
Um, and that movement of history, even though it is violent and strifeful and often tyrannical, is actually moving you closer towards freedom, which is what God wants for humanity. That's the proposition of classical Hegelianism. Um, and that what makes that interesting is a historical take on ideas where ideas are in conflict with each other but are developing throughout time towards something like clearer and clearer definitions. Now, one thing that you can note about this is Hegelianism has a clear, almost Aristotelian teleology. For your audience who doesn't know what that means that Hegel thinks there's a good. For Aristotle, it was reason, but for Hegel, it's freedom. That freedom is driving history itself. That freedom makes man the subject because they can interact with history. They have an action that can make them interact with history, which makes them where freedom can manifest, and thus they become the subject of history. Now, there's a lot of weird Marxist like jargon that does not make that much sense, even though Marxists will use it and don't know this background. I mean, I don't think most Marxists know this today. Um, uh, that's why they talk about universal subjects of history,
Mm.
because there is a teleology to that. What Marx means by flipping Hegel on his head is instead of ideas being what drives history, ideas are driven by historical development. Now, one thing to understand about Marx's philosophical propositions and presumptions is that Marx was interested as a graduate student before he got as politicized in Hegelian readings of Epicureanism.
Mm.
So he is a realist and a materialist, but not in the same way that a lot of modern scientific post 20th century people are, in that he thinks that realism is a formal thing as much as it is just a material thing. So yes, the material is emergent, but the forms emerging from the development of history, which he sees as largely, although not predominantly political economic, we sometimes reduce that to the economic because the economic drives the mode of production. That's different. That's a way of thinking that is different in Marx and in Hegel. Um, for Hegel, the ideas drive the mode of production. Like liberal society is driven by ideas which are manifested in time, and even the miscreants and the unhappy consciousness and the people who violate the state, blah blah blah. They are doing this because um, they are struggling with these ideas in history. And what Marx is saying is no, the ideas emerge from the movement of history itself, and that is how people reproduce themselves. So he is flipping the assumptions, the ontological assumptions,
Mm-hmm.
on their head. He really is. But he does think that Hegel's still fundamentally right, that these ideas play out into battles against each other, and he sees these as battles of more effective modes of production. So what he does really seem to think that humans start out as classless, and there's a lot of anthropological reasons to think that actually he's kind of right about this. The students cut out as relatively classless. They develop classes as a ways of dealing with various ways of reproducing their social situation. And in reproducing their social situation, they often develop classes out of divisions of labor. And for Marx, he kind of thinks you have to go through this. I mean, we can debate this. There are some later works in Marx that actually indicate that maybe he's a little bit more loose on this than he seems in early and middle period Marx. But there's nothing in it that seems to completely throw away that somebody has to go through these processes. Even when he talks about other countries maybe not having to go through capitalism to develop into socialism, he still thinks capitalism has to exist somewhere for the various technologies to have been developed to enable a viable socialism that would not starve people to death to happen. Um, so, and the debates around Russia and the Vera
Mm-hmm.
Sasulik letters, You see him modifying his position, but basically his position is, yeah, Russia maybe through the peasant commune of the Mir could get around having to go through capitalist development, but they would need to get technology from the capitalist West for that to happen. And if they did, then maybe they can skip that developmental phase, but it had to happen somewhere for even anybody to be able to skip it. So you do have a stages version of history. One of the things that makes that complicated, and again, it's a little bit different from Hegel, is Marx thinks that there's a kind of artificial division and bourgeois consciousness between the political and the economic. He doesn't think that's real, but it makes it clearer to talk about in a way that reflects something that is real. So civil society seems separate from the state in a way that it is in prior forms of classed society. Um, Now, you can already see in the way I'm talking about this, there's a structural way in which Marx is only possible from Hegelian thinking, but his entire, like, his assumptions about what's operative here are entirely different. Like, he does not assume there's any ideas that exist outside of themselves. He assumes that there is a teleology to history, but sincerely because certain kinds of modes of production are going to be more rational, efficient, and more effective for human striving than others, not
Mm-hmm.
because they are inherently something that humans are striving for. And he is kind of complicated on things like free will. Free will doesn't really come up in Marx, so this is like a debate that's all over like contemporary philosophy. Marx would say that free will is just an oxymoron, and so is determinism. Humans would have choices, and individuals have more choices than aggregates. But aggregates make history. When aggregates become conscious of their aggregation, they move into to a class consciousness. So they move from the in itself to the for itself category. And in modern say, we might say they move from an aggregate to a collective. Um, and then they can do more because the individual, even though it is a point of maximum freedom, is also the point of least power. The individual cannot survive on their own. I mean, Marx makes a kind of apt observation that we're kind of shitty as animals. Like the other primates, I mean, he wasn't as aware of this, but we know this now. The other primates are stronger than us. You know, they are almost as smart as us. He assumes that our ability to do cooperative labor, labor that is cooperative together, is our biological advantage, and it's part of our species being. Now, I could get into another problem about what species being is. It's a very weird Hegelian concept that people kind of think just means human nature biologically. It doesn't mean that it has something way more specific. And Feuerbach, um, I'm dropping like a massive intellectual geological history here and trying to explain some basic concepts. But I also think they're basic concepts that modern socialists don't really know. They don't think they're important. They kind of start at the practical application of socialism, or like 5 stages down from this. Um, One of the things that I would say is a real ambivalence in Marx that comes out of his Hegelianism is Marx will sometimes argue that socialism is inevitable, and sometimes he will very much argue that it isn't. But that if we don't have socialism, we will be reduced to a common ruin. Most socialists today, I would say, don't really believe that. Are they do believe in like common ruin, but they think it'll be like neo feudalism or techno fascism or uber capitalism or political. They come up with all these new categories. That kind of thinking is actually pretty far into Marx. Um, it's not that Marx thought that socialism was the only answer if you look at the whole of his work, but in his political arguments, he does imply that. Now, there is a tension between Marx's political arguments, his advocacy for socialism, and then what you get in Das Kapital, which is considered more important text. You don't get any way to get to socialism from Das Kapital. There's no like road to socialism out of Capital Volume 1, 2, and 3. There's just kind of a description of what capitalism is, and it's one that ends in a kind of aphoria, an inability to, or aporia, an inability to like really come to terms with the outcome of his own thought. And I'll tell you what it is. In Marx, there's two attempts to define what proletarian is. One is in a footnote in Capital Volume 1, and the other is the end of Capital Volume 3. And in Capital Volume 3, he stops when he gets to proletariat and defining it, because it seems to him like he can't figure out if the proletariat is just the wage earner or the productive worker, and what defines the productivity there, and if that is good. Because in Marx, productivity is not productive to society; it's productive to the capital surplus. So, like for example, if you're not producing capital surplus profit in Marx,
Mm-hmm.
it's unclear for Marx whether or not you're a proletariat. This shows up in his letters too. He has a lot of weird uh, angst around service workers and when they are and are not proletarian, or when they are and are not generating profitability. And this is really important for him, because the question is, are service workers exploited? Not are they dominated and oppressed. He would actually say completely, obviously they are. But are they exploited? Do people get more out of them than it's put in? The answer to that's actually kind of hard, because a lot of times services are also tied into real commodities. Like if you go to barista, we always think of that as a service, but they're delivering you a commodity in a hot consumed drink. That's a physical commodity that you are consuming, that can be traded on the market in abstract like anything else, any other capitalist commodity. So, is it because it's not in a factory? What's the issue there? Well, Marx doesn't assume factory production as the primary driver commodities in Das Kapital. Um, so it does seem like he got himself into a cul-de-sac about even figuring out who is the proletariat. And a couple things to remember about proletariat. Proletariat is a category from ancient Rome. It did not originally mean working class. It meant you had no land holdings,
Mm-hmm.
and thus your relationship to the state was a relationship of in kind. So you would give services or your children's services to the Roman state. You were thus propertyless. You could not. You basically couldn't pay taxes. So your relationship to the state was one of your body. You weren't a slave, and you were not a property holder. The reason why Marx uses that for working class in the 19th century is that the working class did not have what we might call real capital, or the capital that can be used to produce surplus value. They had their labor, and they may have had personal belongings, but these personal belongings were only useful to them as a form of labor, not as a commodity in and of itself. Which is like when you get into like, oh well, people own houses, that means they're not proletariat, or white people have social privilege, and that means they're not proletariat. Marx wouldn't care about any of that. All right. The ownership or non-ownership of houses would only matter if you were renting the house, in which case you were a rentier. Um, that kind of distinction actually probably would have mattered more to Hegel. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so these are all things you want to deal with. Now, I'm going to say that having spelled this all out, I am not truly satisfied that orthodox Marxism, as understood in its various capacities, either through Kautsky, the German philosopher and statesman, leader of the Socialist Party of Germany, the SPD, or Lenin, the key figure of the Bolsheviks, or Plekhanov, the key figure of the Mensheviks and the Russian Social Democratic Party that the split created the Bolsheviks. I'm not sure that orthodoxy, uh, or even pure Marx, would answer all the problems we have today. Um, a couple of things are that uh, the wage relationship has not historically been the dominant relationship of most people to the way they reproduce their life. It is now. Like 80% of the population in the developed world are somehow formal wage earners. Um, but that actually creates a whole separate set of contradictions, because these are not, the wage earners are not a category of people that are actually equal in their social holdings. They're not equal in their relationship to capital or property. Um, and attempts to come up with new classes to kind of deal with this problem. The PMC is the classic one right now. Is the reappropriation of an idea from the late 1970s by John and Barbara Ehrenreich, about a professional managerial class that had come up from the working class primarily, actually,
Mm-hmm.
despite what people will say, different from the managerial class, which came down from aristocratic elites. That's James Burnham's thesis, and a lot of thesis of fascists and elitist thinkers from Italy. Um, but uh, what Ehrenreich was trying to do was combine that kind of prior thing with what they were seeing post the GI Bill, and with the note that like 20% of the population at this time was going to college, up from like 5%,
Mm-hmm.
and that these people were mostly entering management. Now, that's not true today.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Most college workers are not entering management. They're entering white collar jobs, which used to not require any degree at all.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and the idea that physical labor is what separates out proletarian from non-proletarian is not coherent. Marx rejected it. In fact, one of his examples about productive workers and wage labor was a teacher who was working for a private school producing capital that could be traded on the market. So it wasn't just about industrial workers.
Right.
But in Orthodox Marxism and classical Marxism, they assumed it was about industrial workers. I mean, Kautsky does. But this also presented a real problem because as the wage relationship expanded, the industrial part of capital, and nowhere in the world has ever achieved the majority of the population, which which the classical Marxists, not so much Marx himself, but the classical Marxists assumed, almost again on Hegelian grounds, like we were going to develop these ideas. That means that more and more people were going to be pushed into the proletarian relations, and they were right in that more and more people were going to be pushed into wage relations.
Mm-hmm.
But they seem to have been wrong um, from another idea that Marx had called the organic development of capital. So the organic development of capital is this idea that you can reduce socially necessary. I'm gonna, for your people who don't know Marx's theory, this is going to come off as a lot of jargon. If you need to stop me and have me break down any concept, just tell me. But that the organic development of capital, the organic rate of capital accumulation, would lead to technology reducing the socially necessary labor time, but that this would be bad because you would still need variable capital, and variable capital is human beings that are not slaves to to exploit to get your profits up.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you didn't, eventually the entire way that you could increase income flows and all this would break down. Um, that uh, the market would push prices down to cost eventually. The cost would be fixed so you couldn't exploit it. So then profits would be harder and harder to get. You probably have to do something like convert profits into rents, which could also be treated as profits, but they'd be limited to this too. And this would cause capital to break down. Now, one of the contradictions in Marx is there's basically two different theories for how capitalism ends.
Mm-hmm.
One is this is organic composition problem, and one is basically the workers overthrow it. And Marx always focuses on the latter because it's political.
Right.
And it has a clear solution. Marx thinks the clear solution of this is socialism. Now, we can debate all day about whether socialism has been popular amongst the working class. The historically speaking, in the early 20th century, it kind of was, but it was never the predominant ideology amongst the working class. But it was way more popular amongst working class people than it is today. Um, so you've had all these problems develop. From the standpoint, for example, today there's a communization theorist named Phil Neal who I don't agree on his answers to these problems, but he points out these problems pretty well. That, for example, let's say you reshored all the economy the way Trump wants to the United States. It would only employ about 15% of what it employed in the 1950s. The efficiency of the machinery, etc., would make it just you just don't need as many people, and it also makes it harder for workers to organize because when unions organized in a shop in the 1950s, they got 7, 8, 9,000 workers at one time in one union. When you organize in a shop at Starbucks, you get 40.
Mm-hmm.
And so both the ability to make profits, and if you look at the 1950s, is a high profitability period. Now, one of the things that makes this all really confusing to everybody, and I know you asked me about Hegel, I've gone off on this long debate about Marx, like this is like a lecture I would give, but is that the way Liberals figure out profits, which is based on income ratios to GDP, and
Mm-hmm.
the way Marxists figure out profits aren't actually the same thing. Because the way that like maybe you would figure out a profit and I'm not even sure you can do with our numbers what Marx wants you to be able to do, which is to figure out an aggregate of all the individual profits per item. So I would figure out like, okay, all the items make this much per item profitability. Um, and uh, I would figure out that average, and then I would look at the cost and see how much per item would be on the cost on the average of everything in the market.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and while that seems really simple to explain, I like actually figuring out that math is insanely difficult. The closest thing we have to it is GDP growth. But GDP growth is really confusing because any kind of economic transfer from one person to another looks like a profitability according to liberal estimations of GDP growth. So, for example, if I'm doing massive investments in AI, even though the AI companies aren't making profits, but maybe Nvidia is, um, that still looks like a lot of economic activity, even though like that's really just a wealth transfer. There's no new wealth, or there's no new value, not wealth, value created to invest in anything that would produce wealth. And another thing to remember about liberals and neoclassical economists do not separate wealth and value the way Marxists do. So value is an abstract measure. Wealth is stuff that physically exists that you can actually use. It
Mm-hmm.
has use values. Uh, um, Abstract labor and abstract value are value to court does not necessarily have use values. You can't eat it, and you also don't necessarily know what it is. So, for example, we talk about fictitious capital. Um, let's say, and a lot of people get really confused on this, but I'll just try to explain it very simply. Let's say you're Elon Musk. You have infinite number of shares, but you're highly debt leveraged. Your fictitious capital is your estimated net worth. But let's say you go to actually sell all your assets to pay off your debts, and your net worth after deducting debts, when you actually valorize it in the market by selling it, may be zero. You don't know um, until the moment that is sold. You do not know if your estimated values actually correspond to your real values, and thus the difference between that is what we call fictitious capital. And fictitious capital cannot be known until the commodity is sold. Um, so what makes this wild is this all is to tie it all back to where we originally started because it seems very abstract, but this all is based off Hegelian propositions that you would build towards a more and more abstract way of organizing your economy. Until the point and Marx thinks these abstracts will undo the very freedom that early bourgeois society set up, and that's why he talks about bourgeois revolutions being unfinished. Now, it's also important to remember that Marx was talking about like Germany, where liberal revolutions really were literally unfinished. They still had a king. They're still in a late medieval form of government.
Right.
But he also meant this abstractly, and like the promises of bourgeois society, the things that they promise, freedom, equality, and solidarity, or what they would call fraternity, are not just contradictory, but impossible not to be contradictory in a capitalist society. Because the capitalist development was a limit to civil society. It is an unfreedom that seems free because there are arbitrary things imposed on people that have nothing to do with their merit. Like whether or not you have resources at birth has nothing to do with your merit. And even like 19th century American liberals realized this. It wasn't just socialists. Like Henry George, I guess Henry George is kind of a socialist, but Mark Twain, a lot of them complained about inheritance and all this, meaning that like there was no meritocracy. This is still has a shadow of this feudal system
Mm-hmm.
within liberalism. And then Marx goes even further and says, like, look at France during the reign of Napoleon Bonaparte. Not only do liberals and protecting the property part of their proposition start to not believe in it, they will even regress to medieval and prior forms of government to maintain that profitability, which undoes what they said the profitability was for,
Mm-hmm.
which were these abstract values like liberty, equality, fraternity. Um, and yeah, I mean, you can kind of see this play out over the 20th century in a variety of ways. But like I said, you asked what my problem with it was. And my problem with it is I think Marx was a little bit too sure about the outcome, um, because he assumed that a class had to be the universal, a class that become for itself, not just in itself, to become more than its sociological category. But then, like, what does that mean? Because you'll have Marxists first say, well, what the actual working class thinks is not important. There's a working class idea that is for itself, that is beyond what any worker actually believes.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just like, well, you can do anything with that. I can say, like, there's a working class ideal in the universe that believes in X, and you don't believe in X. Does the working class manifest that? No, that's irrelevant because we know what the real value of the working class is from this Hegelian logic. Therefore, um, I know what the work. Basically, it makes the working class think like me. And how do I know that? When the working class does what I want them to. And so you get into this impossible situation with this line of thinking. Um, I actually don't think Marx is consistent as a lot of other Marxists you've had on your show think. I think maybe Mac McManus and I are closer than, say, me and Chris Catrone on this, where I think Marx actually is inconsistent on these things over time. Not in the way that you might hear from like Althusserian academics to say there's an epistemological break in Marx. I don't think that exists. I think Marx had these ideas. He more or less believed in them, but he would see real time limits in them. I'll give you an example. In the 1850s, he clearly thought that crises in capitalism were going to produce a revolution because of the immiseration of the newly formed industrial working class, which was brand new. All right,
Right.
been around in Europe for like 30 years, been around in England for 100. Well, been around in Europe for about 50 years because you start seeing it a little bit in France, but not. It's still relatively young. You're dealing with 2 or 3 generations,
Mm-hmm.
five at most, even in England. Um, and really, the conditions of this working class proletariat being industrialized, again, very new, probably at most 30, 40 years even in England. So he thinks that they're being made poor by these great depressions that are raging in the middle of the 19th century. And he thinks that that's going to cause them to have a revolt immediately, like what happened in 1848, except now it's going to be the workers overthrowing the bourgeoisie who just tried to overthrow their feudal governments. And we are talking in the matter of a decade. And in some ways, a lot of Marx's later thoughts is reacting to the fact that he did not see that happen. Right? That's not an epistemological break. That's not him abandoning Hegel. That's him reacting to the world as he see it and realizing his predictions were wrong. Um, and so I do think there's a lot of that transitionary thinking in Marx. Marx is also very uncomfortable. I mean, it's funny because most liberals and conservatives think Marx is like a hyper statist, like,
Right.
but Marx is very uncomfortable with the state.
Yeah.
In 1847, 1848, he's proposing stuff like a progressive income tax. If you read
Mm.
the stuff in the Communist League's manifesto, the Communist Manifesto, you'll see stuff like that.
Right.
By like the 1860s, he's like, we shouldn't be giving the state a dime because it's not our state.
Mm.
It's not a worker state, and even a worker state isn't what we really want. We want a society that is classless, and a classless society cannot, by definition, have a group of people that rules over it by prerogative.
Mm.
Everybody would have to participate in that governance, and if you had everyone participating in that governance, it's hard to call it a state because no singular group of society would have a monopoly on violence. The monopoly on violence stuff, that's from Weber. Marx
Mm.
doesn't use that terminology, but he's implying it. Um, so so you have all these things, so in that sense, like Marx is almost an anarchist, but he does not think you can just get rid of the state tomorrow because civil society would collapse. That
Right.
we are too integrated in the state. We don't know how to do self-governance anymore. We've all been living in these atomized parts of society, um, and that we'd have to basically work through it by slowly taking more and more functions of the state on ourselves and having a state that does that. Now, the anarchist would say, why would a state ever give up its power once you've given it to it? Liberals would say that too. And I think that's a fair question. Um, but that was what they believed. And so understanding that makes like a lot of discussions about Marxism for now, even amongst Marxists, kind of just useless because like they don't understand this historical logic that comes out of Hegel, even to critique it. A lot of the people they're citing do, but if you deal with like, I don't know if you're in academia, but if you deal in academia today, you'll learn that like often you are citing a like five, six sources down from what the original citation.
Right.
And if you go back and read the real thing, or not, I shouldn't say the real thing. You go back and read the original citation, it means something completely different than the way it's been reappropriated in the various fields.
Mm-hmm.
And PhDs today, because there's so much literature and they're so specialized, they're only reading the tertiary or above references
Right.
to these things and taking the
Mm-hmm.
references in their field as correct for what the original thing meant. I have read so many academic papers who will take a misunderstanding from a third source and repeat it over and over and over again, or even read it wrong, and it gets read wrong by another source later, and they just cite that over and over and over again.
Mm-hmm.
So this is a problem I think that Marx does not deal with. The other problem that he doesn't deal with, Marx believed in this thing called the general intellect. He did not think that collective knowledge could be privatized. Um, you know, he thought that once you develop collective knowledge, the capitalists are going to do their damnedest to keep it under the wraps, but it will not be privatizable.
Right.
And unfortunately, that does not seem to be the case.
Mm-hmm.
There does seem to be a way in which, I mean, and the irony today is, for example, is like we really do have pretty much free collective knowledge. It's almost infinite.
Right.
You can check me if you want to at any time. You can just go on. You don't need individual experts in the same way. And yet, expertise dominates our society more and more and more because it's devalued a lot of that expertise, and because also um, the way it's used to signal in liberal society is not that you know this stuff, it's that you had the ability to pay for the formal access to this stuff,
Right.
or someone has vouched for you so that they did it.
Right.
And in that way, you have seen a privatization of the general intellect in a way that makes the general knowledge of society just less relevant to its functioning. And I think you see that in the fact that American elites today, liberal, conservative, whatever, are increasingly hyper specialized in one thing, but myopic and kind of stupid on everything else.
Yeah.
Um, we do not live in a society that has a lot of generalists. If you came to me and you wanted academic advice, I'd say, as a person, I'd tell you to be a generalist. It's going to be better for you, but you're not going to get a job doing that.
Yeah.
They want a cog in a machine, and you need to figure out what cog you're good at. But
Mm-hmm.
if you look at that, this is a theory that I pull from complexity theory, particularly the thinking of Joseph Tainter. And I actually do say this is a problem with Marxism
Mm-hmm.
because they assume the specialization and the centralization of knowledge can go on infinitely and become more and more powerful. And I just don't think that's true. I think what you see is specialization causes trade offs where you have less and less people have general knowledge, and specialists do not see the results or the unanticipated consequences in other areas. And because of that, a specialist actually will sometimes make a decision that is rational and smart for their own narrow niche,
Right.
but highly destructive to overall society.
Right.
And society responds to that by rejecting not the specialist nicheness, but knowledge altogether. And so, and I'm using society as abstract here, but we can see this in America. I mean, no one trusts experts anymore. And liberals are always trying to arguing for expertise when it's convenient for them. Um, you know, and then that becomes its own mantra, but no one really understands the science of what's going on, and like the specialists don't know either. And I do think that's a limit to both Hegelian and Marxist thought. Like there is the ability to build a general intellect is not infinite. Um, and so what do you do with that? Um, and yeah, that's a huge answer. You gave me one question. I'm going on for like 45 minutes, so I'm gonna stop. But there you go.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things. So I would be curious to hear. My only objection to what you said about Hegel is it does seem like there's a reading of Hegel at least. I haven't read his lectures on religion, but there is a side of Hegel where he's essentially saying that humans are like self overcoming and self creating. Like everything that exists for philosophy is originated within ourselves.
Mhm.
And that seems to me to be very anti religious. Like that does seem to be so I mean you can make there's definitely like the religious part in Hegel where religion is kind of his like blueprint and his guiding light. But it seems like he thinks that ultimately all of that is human created, self overcoming, which seems like effectively atheist. It's not like atheist in kind of our modern understanding, but like in effect. But I'm curious if you would disagree with that, or if there's like if you would.
I would complicate that because what he's saying is like I mean, from the standpoint of a Christian, of this like kind of Hegelian Christian standpoint, he does think humans are sui generis, that we create ourselves because we've been created to create ourselves in this weird way.
Hmm,
Like we are like God. God is self-sufficient, so we also have to be self-sufficient. This kind of like very Protestant Christian way of thinking. I mean, you do see it in Catholic thinkers, but it's a lot rarer, is not common amongst modern evangelicals. Most modern evangelicals are pietists. So where he would be anti-religious in that he would think that religious dogma is human created.
right.
Um, I do not think that would make him atheistic, but we could go back and forth on that. But that is why, like for example, he's considered heretical in a lot of
Hmm,
parts of the Catholic Church,
of course.
and a lot of Protestants consider him basically a heretic too, because he would basically say, well, our dogmas are self created, because we are creating these ideas that are getting us true closer to the absolute idea, which is a manifestation of God. But this manifestation of God can only be manifested by us through our own action. So there would not be a revelatory church that would have revelatory dogma that could tell us what to do.
Right.
Um, God would not work out that way, because if God did, we would not have freedom.
Hmm,
So in this way, you could say like, well, he's taking Protestantism. I mean, there are some Catholics who say this, for example, and some atheists
right.
who would say he's taking Protestantism to such a logical extreme that it's affected. Like if God exists or God doesn't exist in his universe, the only thing that becomes strange about it is how do you justify this absolute ideal that you are
Hmm,
moving towards?
right.
Um, so I would say you could read Hegel in this way, that is anti-religious dogma. Although he was a faithful Lutheran, so that's a little weird. But I do think that you can't say that he's like a classical Lutheran either.
Hmm,
He is developing this in a very particular way. Um, but I think if you called Hegel an atheist, he would look at you like you were insane.
hmm,
Um, and I know that there's been a lot of attempts to read a lot of modern philosophers. Descartes, another one that we tend to read atheistically, because
right.
they assume basically that the material world is our limit of knowledge and what else. But I've gone through their stuff, and I'm like, I don't see any evidence that they actually don't believe in God. They just don't think about it in this like pietistic way that we think about it now. Um, uh, there are some exceptions. I would say that, for example, Spinoza is so pantheistic that he might as well be an atheist. Uh, uh, and Hegel, I think Hegel believes in human freedom so much that he could not believe in a revealed church. That would undermine his theology and his teleology. Um, and I mean, I think that's a interesting concept, because another thing that you look at with Hegel's belief in freedom is he still does believe in the state. I mean,
Right.
Hegel basically, by the time you get the philosophy of right, he thinks a constitutional monarchy with a parliament, because it dialectically combines, the democratic
Right.
with the kingship, is actually probably the ideal state. And like
Mm-hmm.
bourgeois society as of Germany in like 1820 is probably an ideal economy. It's a very early modern, very artisanal economy. It's not, there's not even really like developed industrial
Mm-hmm.
proletariat yet there. Um, and a unified Germany would be an ideal unification of a nation state based off of what they learned from Napoleon's like freeing Europe. But it's it's Hegel also changed a lot in his life. I mean, politically, he like you go from Napoleon to basically the the Second Reich, as your
Sure.
model. Um, so, but I do see that rejection to the centrality of religiousness because I think we mean something um, very particular about religion, um, and Hegel means something much broader. Even though he probably still participated in the religious institutions of his society, but I don't think he was doing it just cynically. I don't think we have any evidence for that. Um, I mean, he might be. It's a possibility, but I think if you're arguing that, you do have to produce some evidence that he
Right.
was, and the only evidence you have is conjectures about freedom, and the way he thinks humans are self-organizing. But you can also explain that by him
Hmm.
thinking that God is self-organizing, humans are created in the
Yeah.
image of God, thus they must also be self-organizing, and self-actuating. Um, and I think in Marx, it's way. I think to bring this back a little bit. I think in Marx, this is way more confusing because why does Marx believe that humans are self-actualizing? He seems to, right? Although he talks about how we're not in total control. There's a historical limit to what we do. There's a
Right.
historical, like he talks about the fact, like when he talks about human species beings, he makes a comparison to a dog.
Hmm.
It's like we don't know what a dog species being is because we've never seen a dog like in a completely natural environment where he's completely free of human interaction,
Right.
and you wouldn't, right?
Hmm.
And if you think about this, even like I wouldn't say anthropology is the wrong word. If you look at like um, uh, mammal psychology, Marx actually was onto something there. Our wolf studies, for example, assumed that wolves in captivity were generalized behavior was generalizable to wolves in the wild, and it took us about 100 years to figure out that was not true.
Hmm.
That our observation of wolves and the way they socialize in captivity are specific to wolves socializing in captivity. They are
Right.
not the same as wolves socializing in the wild. And I mean, Marx would say that would be true with humans as well. And
Hmm.
he would again argue that what makes us unique isn't our intelligence, it isn't our thumb exactly. He has a weird Lamarckian view of how the thumb developed. I'm not going to get into it, but like
Okay.
he would say it's our ability to do collective labor.
Hmm.
Um, Anthropologically, I'm actually going to say he's kind of wrong. Um, I mean, he's right in that labor has something to do with it, but actually, most modern anthropologists would tell you that what makes humans different from other primates is that we will care for our young, who are not related to us, instead of killing them. And
Hmm.
that, like, not that we aren't super violent, we are one of the most violent species on the fucking planet, but like if I grab, like, so if somebody gives me the child of another human being, even the wild, the presumption is from what we've seen from humans is we won't just eat it if it's not ours. A
Right.
chimp will.
Hmm.
Like, there's no way a chimp mother is giving a random male their baby. That's not true for humans. So, in a way, it is collective labor, but it's very specific collective labor to social reproduction, not just economic reproduction, that would be unique to human beings from other primates. And even that's not totally unique. You see that trait to lesser degrees in other primates, but humans are particular about it. Like, it is really rare for us to just go and eat someone else's baby. I mean, I know that sounds ridiculous, but the reason why it sounds ridiculous is we don't do it,
Right.
um, except in very extreme circumstances.
Right. So, I mean, yeah, you were bringing up there a lot of the problems with Marx and taking in philosophy. I guess especially pointing out a lot of the uncertainty and a lot of the problems that we're still working through. And so my question would be like, where do you come out on kind of philosophy in general? Like, what do you think? Like, do you think it's important for us to ground out our philosophy? Because that's really what people like Hegel are trying to do. Is they're trying to, and I would argue the reason why Hegel has religion is it's serving the purpose of grounding everything objectively. I mean, that's really
Mm-hmm.
what he uses it for, right? So yeah, where do you come out on? Because there are Marxists who are kind of like anti-philosophy. They basically just say we don't need philosophy. Philosophy is playing a game that is not playable. It's not worth playing. You even have philosophers who are anti-philosophy at this point, obviously. So yeah, where do you come out on that? Because obviously there's all sorts of yeah, you could be completely anti-philosophy, or you could take the hardcore Hegelian Marxist approach, with all the telos of that. So yeah, where do you come out on that personally?
Um, I view philosophy as a form of pathology of thinking. It's deliberately to medicine. It's deliberately actually to diagnostic medicine. So what I'm looking at when I deal with philosophy is the way in which ideas develop, and for me, in a material context, in their social relations, that um, can show you the ways in which humans are likely to think given a set of inputs, and to draw out from that set of inputs various different ways of framing that. So I do think understanding philosophy is important, but I always historicize philosophy. I mean, in this way, like I even try to do it with Marxism. Like Marxism has many different historical phases. There's both political and economic reasons why it shifts when it does. Um, and so I would say, for example, the idea that philosophy is going to get you to the truth um, is kind of a joke. But the idea that philosophy is going to let you be able to rule out things that are untrue or that cannot be true, or to understand why there is instead of assuming that people who disagree with you are irrational, you need to play out their models of mind. And to model their mind, you do actually have to be able to model very philosophical, ontological, epistemic
Right.
prepositions, and then model that, and then see if it matches what they actually do. And like ideological critique for me is like the distance between what people do and the way they justify what they do.
Mm.
But I don't think like philosophy is going to deliver you the absolute truth. And one of the reasons why I reject the Marxist rejection of philosophy at all is that they assume, I mean, Marx says, like, Hegel's philosophy is to get you to understand the world. Our job is to change it. But that actually, in the thesis on Feuerbach, assumes that we actually already understand the world enough.
Mm-hmm.
And my preposition in some ways is like, if I take Marx's other assumptions that his historical material reality is always changing,
Mm-hmm.
and that's changing the way in which what thoughts can survive, manifest in the world, then I can't stop with philosophy um, to change the world, because the world is changing too. So just because I understood the world, let's say Hegel was absolutely right, which I
Right.
don't think he was, but let's just say he was in 1820. Um, that doesn't do me a lot of good in 2025. And because the material world is different, the contexts are different.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so I would say I probably have more of a pathological slash anthropological view of what philosophy is than most pro or anti philosophers. The one thing I will say that you're not going to get rid of, and Marxism tries to do, I think this is one of the areas where Marxism is kind of incoherent, um, is the removal of the ethical from human interaction. And by that I mean the removal of norms from human interaction.
Right.
Like Marxism tries to just say we're not going to deal with the norms problem. We're going to try to figure out what ought to be from what is. We can already see this is going to be a problem. This is what Hegel was trying to do too.
Mm-hmm.
But if you go back to Hume, Hume says there's no real justification for doing that, right? And
Right.
unfortunately, I think Hume is right. There is no justification from assuming that a description implies a norm just because it exists. Because the other thing you're doing is you're going to assume that norms are static, and then why does anything change? And there are other Marxist philosophers who came to this problem. I mean, Althusser and Lukács both do, and it kind of broke their philosophy because they couldn't explain. Like, for example, if you assume in Lukács's terms, not Lukács's term, Althusser's term, that the structural is the real and that's ideological, the only way you get around it is this thing called aleatory materialism, But then what you're saying is change is stochastic. You have no control of it. Stuff just changes because atoms move. There's indeterminacy ultimately in
Right.
nature. And then why do you have a revolutionary project? What is revolutionary politics for?
Right.
And I don't think Althusser actually can really answer that at the end of his life. I really don't.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so, I have my friend Nico Villarreal, I mentioned on your show, who radically disagrees with me on that last part. But like Lukács is to bring up him and history and class consciousness. You know when something has class consciousness because it manifests a revolution. How do you know that? Because the revolution is happening. That's perfectly circular and non-predictive.
Yeah.
I can't so I know when the revolution happens when it happens because we enact the working class, but we don't have to know what the working class thinks to do that.
Right.
Like that just doesn't actually make a lot of sense. It's perfectly circular in an irrational way, and so um, I just find those philosophical attempts to be very frustrating. The one thing I would say about um, I mentioned one thinker that I pull from this that makes me different from a lot of Marxists. Another thinker that I pull from is a former Marxist come Catholic called Lester McIntyre.
Mm.
And one of the things I pull from McIntyre is that the absolute insistence that there is no distinction between norms and descriptions, and that you can rationally deduce norms because of it, either through deontology or utilitarianism, means that liberalism, by and large, today, as an ideology and as an idea set, is very emotive, um, because you cannot rationally deduce what your primary axioms are. Even from a logical standpoint, axioms are definitionally unprovable. That's why they're axioms.
Right.
Um, and because of that, uh, when you go to like prove what the greatest good is, you get both. If you, from a utilitarian standpoint, you get Bentham and Mill, but you also get Benatar, who thinks that we should end all human life, all life, period, not by killing it, but just by letting it die off because pain,
Mm-hmm.
because we're using a utilitarian calculus on pleasure that says pain is more worse than pleasure. There will always be pain, therefore we should end life,
Right.
period, all life. Um, or you get Peter Singer, who's like, well, we believe in liberal rights, but we also believe that all functional beings who are at peak should survive. So I should be a vegetarian, but I should also euthanize the disabled. Like because their struggle in life. You know, and McIntyre says this is just a motive because what you are actually doing is hiding your emotive presumptions because you're not trying to integrate them with any prior axioms, right? So in that sense, also, I still believe in philosophy because you have to have a way to deal with the incongruence of what we say we believe and how we work that out,
Right.
and then what we actually do. And purely rationalist ways of doing that that also say that you can collapse is and oughts tend to actually just be whatever biases I have, I'm going to figure out a way to set my categories so that I can say that it's rational. And we can see that from the fact that two people who believe the same set of prepositions about morality come to radically different conclusions than other people who believe the same set of prepositions about morality. And I Marxists would like to get out of that, or they'd like to say that is irrelevant. And I would say, I'm almost a classical Aristotelian in this way. You can't say politics and ethics are the same thing, but they come out of impulses that are related. So you cannot fully separate them either. You do have norms in politics. If someone rejects the idea of equality, even for example, I think most forms of liberal equality are irrelevant. I'm actually going to say that. That's like I do care about power equality because power equality affects um, how people can position themselves to others. But even I have to say that like I cannot justify that in anything like objective beyond me. I can say that I believe from prior anthropological studies that societies that are relatively equal make good collective decisions because everyone has inputs, and that the incentives for irrational actions go down
Mm-hmm.
even though collectives can be highly irrational. They like when you have to make decisions where the entire group lives or dies based off of them, you kind of have to make smarter decisions or you won't survive very long. And so I can argue that, but I'm still accepting that that's a good norm. Because someone might say, yeah, but I just think, individual virtue and value cannot be manifested collectively because definitionally it's individual, and
Right.
I don't give a shit. And like, what do I have to say to that? Like from a descriptive standpoint, I just have to admit we have fundamentally different values that are irreconcilable. And unfortunately, if we deal with this, if we think about what Marx says about this, what decides that? Force. Between equal claims, force decides. So um, it and I do think we have to like force, however, is not just based on your individual power; it's based on your ability to command and operate society. And one of my critiques of contemporary liberalism as opposed to like classical liberalism, and I don't mean by that what most like
Yeah.
conservatives mean by that. They
Right.
created a myth of classical liberalism, but that's much more unified and cleaned up and market based. Those people existed. I mean, they're real. I'm not saying they're not, but that
Hmm.
wasn't the only thing that came out of classical liberalism.
Right.
But like classical liberalism's contradictions, like in this, have you ever read Jonathan Israel's like 3 volume, like 6,000 word history
No.
where he breaks up into radical liberals, like moderate liberals,
Right.
he goes through this. So I've never said that liberalism's ever been unified, right? It really hasn't.
Hmm.
Um, it's, but I actually agree, even with some reactionaries today, that what survives of liberalism is kind of emotive propositions about what we think rights should be, but we can't justify those rights in anything. Like when liberals assert rights, they'll assert them based off of like, well, I believe that queer people have rights, and I could be like, why? And they'll be like, because they do. And they'll be
Right.
like, okay, but why? All right. When I go back to John Locke or to Hobbes doesn't believe in rights anyway. But you're going to get some argument about like, well, people have rights because of natural law. Natural law exists because that's the way God wills the world. But God thinks that we should operate ourselves, so we don't need these divine revelated religions, and because people just make that shit up. So we can learn natural law ourselves. Blah 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 blah. There is no liberal today that believes in natural law, right?
Right.
So I actually do think there's that liberalism is in a real crisis. This is the difference between me and Matt McManus. Like Matt McManus talks about liberal
Hmm.
socialism, and I'm like, yeah, you're right. Socialism is a result of a crisis in liberalism. Um, but that crisis has been ongoing even amongst liberals themselves. Like if you look at the American political spectrum until very recently, the entire spectrum was liberal,
Right.
like in a big L sense.
Hmm.
That's not so much true now. And it's been other times where it wasn't true in like the Jim Crow South. It wasn't true in the Confederacy. Um, well, even that's a little questionable. But for example, the great debate right now, we talk about whether or not Trump's a fascist, right?
Right.
Um, and I just think that I always say like fascism is an imminent crisis in the ideologies that have emerged since liberalism, right? It's not particularly coherent. If I try to make it coherent, like if I try to come up with a political economy of fascism, Italy, Romania, and Nazi Germany are radically different. Um, Italy started off as basically national syndicalist and ends up as pretty much corporatist. And what they don't mean by that is ruled by corporations. I mean, the corporations and all classes cooperate with the state.
Mm.
Like you can kind of test if someone actually understands what fascism means, where they say fascism is ruled by corporations because they don't. They are reading a translation of Mussolini extremely literally, and they don't really know what the fuck they're talking about.
Right.
But um, but fascism is going to emerge over and over and over again because liberalism has decayed crises and pulls from other historical things. If you meet other kinds of like very, very right wing people, some of which scare me more than even fascists, to be quite honest, they think fascism is liberal. Go read Avola. Like he thinks fascism is a liberal problem. I mean, the same way that Marxists will say fascism is a liberal problem. Although Marxists will also try to hide from you, for example, that the coterie of the Italian fascists, almost all of whom were either anarchist or Marxist,
Mm.
who became more and more integralist. I mean, by that, they thought we needed an integrated state. And it is also true that a lot of liberals like FDR at first idolized this and thought it was a natural result of liberal presumptions. So you see some like get like if I don't know how old you are, but like 20 years ago, Jonah Goldberg wrote a stupid book called Liberal Fascist. Um, is mostly a joke, but he's actually right about a few things. The early progressive liberals did praise early fascism pretty extensively.
Right.
Um, they were not as keen on Nazi Germany, although some did like it. But uh, but that's to me that doesn't actually say much about like some Stalin, some neo Marxist Leninist. Actually, I won't call them Stalinists because that's confusing. Um, will say that like, oh, this is proof of liberalism's like degeneracy. And I'm like, but we are all products. Modern reactionaryism, even de Maistre, is a product of liberal thinking out of Europe. Other political traditions do not have that valence. You're not talking about liberal Confucianism, for example, until you start seeing European ideas interacting with Chinese ones. So I do think that you have to kind of admit that both liberalism is in a crisis right now, but that it's partly because it like what defines liberalism other than atomized personal choice a la Fukuyama. I always talk about people who mention Fukuyama's End of History book, right? And you always tell that they read like the first. They didn't even read the whole fucking title because the title is The End of History and the Last Man. It's an attempt to synthesize Hegel
Right.
and Nietzsche um, into like one unified picture of like what the West and Japan was going to develop into. And what he says is basically, and he doesn't mean this just positively, and he doesn't mean it just negatively either, that atomization and individual rights are going to be popular everywhere because everyone can understand them. And because of that, other notions of politics are going to have a hard time staying dominant. They might
Mm-hmm.
come up, but they're going to stay dominant. And that this is not all good, right? Because it will break down social cohesion. It will break down the ability of people to act collectively. He talks about like, things that people talk about now about like, late Japanese culture or Korean culture or even Chinese
Mm-hmm.
culture, like lay down people, stuff like that you were hearing 10 years ago. He talks about that in the 80s, right? As a result of this, like hyperatomization was going to lead to this. Um, my thing when I tell people is like, yeah, that might be ending. I actually do think maybe we are at the end of history, but that's still the dominant form of liberalism, and that's still a dominant form of social organization. And it's more true now in our little bubbles on the internet than it was in the 1980s. Even though we are reacting more strongly against it, we can think about like any assassin from Charlie Kirk to the Evergreen shooter who shot 3 kids, right? Um, Obviously that's horrible. Uh, it is random political violence, but even though we know, for example, Taylor Robinson seemed to have a relationship with his trans roommate that motivated what he did. People are going to be reading tea leaves on those memes because they're underdetermined. People, they're trolls, and people and different factions of Zoomer, you know, leftist
Mm-hmm.
will troll each other with them. It's hard to say, even after we know that this involves like a personal relationship with a trans person for Taylor Robinson, that he was ideologically motivated in any coherent way because right now that atomization is leading to more and more niche and ironic ideologies that are harder and harder to place anywhere. And honestly, that's a crisis of liberalism. And it also has led to what I like to call when you all your theories of history go away, you get left with Carl Smith's friend enemy distinction. And by that, you'll see, for example, no hypocrisy is untouchable because all you're doing is friend enemy. So,
Right.
oh, it's not just that we're against hate speech now, we are for regulation of hate speech, but for rich, dead, white, conservative Christians. Um, so all principles, all the free speech that's already out the window from
Right.
these people. Like, so this breakdown also means that there's no values of which people can equivocate to any form of liberalism and hold people accountable to. And I do kind of think we're in a social crisis before that. And I think it ties to an economic crisis. I think they're related. But unlike a lot of the other Marxists on your show, I don't think you can say they're one to one just caused by the other.
Right.
Um, there's a feedback loop there. Maybe that helps. I know that you've asked me two questions and I've gone on a lot.
Yeah, I mean, I don't disagree that it's undeniable that there's like some kind of crisis with liberalism. One of the problems I have is about philosophy and also liberalism, and I made this like short video called "Skepticism and Philosophy" where I make this point, which is basically that people are very content to like criticize skepticism or criticize liberalism because they are incoherent, right?
Mm.
And my point has always been, I mean, you can say it's incoherent, and it is, um, but you denying that process of working through puts you really behind anything. I mean, who is really like a committed Hegelian Marxist? Who is really a committed Marxist? I mean, who is really anything? Like all of this is like all of our ideologies are incoherent, and so yeah, I mean that's one of the things I point out because people can say that I'm incoherent. Like I say I'm a liberal and liberalism is dead, and I'm like okay sure, but I mean I'm trying to work through this. I think that's what everyone has to do, and you're just kind of in denial about the fact that you have to do that. Um, and that's
Well,
kind of yeah. Go on.
no. I mean, I'm thinking about what you're saying, and this gets us back to a very Hegelian point. I mean, like, so here's what I would say to you is I'm a product of liberal society.
Mm-hmm.
If liberalism is incoherent, so am I. And my my feelings about that, my ethical norms about that, they're important to me. They don't give a shit. I mean, it doesn't matter to larger society.
Right.
I always say this in terms of a quote by Adorno: a wrong life cannot be lived rightly."
Mm.
Um, and what I've always meant by that is that like you can, one of my critiques of Marxists is we'll just use liberal as a slur.
Yeah.
Like that's liberal. This is liberal. Those are liberals. They're all liberals.
Right.
And I've always, this is where I kind of agree with Matt McManus, even though I don't think Marxism at this point is liberalism. I do think we are kind of
Right.
attempting to be something separate.
Mm-hmm.
Notice I said attempting.
Yeah.
um, uh, we have not actually fully achieved that. Even like if you argue about Chinese socialism, it has liberal characteristics. It would acknowledge that
Of
even
course.
though some of its fans here would not.
Of course. Yeah.
Um, uh, you know, uh, its view of economic development is that basically you have to go through state controlled capitalism to stop the excesses of capitalism from destroying everything, but it's still you have to go through capitalism to develop the accumulation to have socialism. And they do keep on, I mean, even though the 1982 Chinese constitution does say that they achieved socialism in 1982. The heads of the Communist Party, since at least Xi Jinping, have been saying we're not going to achieve all the socialist reforms necessary to even meet socialism until some future date. And right now it's 2050. It does keep on getting pushed back. This is my point. Um, so they would acknowledge that they've had to take in elements of liberal society and try to curtail them to exist, which does mean, in some fundamental way, even the most diehard anti-imperialist Dominico Lacerda lover, for all their critiques of liberalism, have accepted certain liberal premises to their fundamental project, whether they like it or not. So if they accuse you of being incoherent, well, the thing is, we all are. We can't get around that. My what I actually get more mad at is when people don't think we should try
Mm.
to be coherent, because I do think that leads to friend enemy logic and total
Right.
hypocrisy. Um, and I see this from both. I mean, like, we're talking about liberalism, big L, but obviously, if we talk about liberalism, small L, in regards to the Democratic Party, the Democratic Party is both a very liberal and a very illiberal party at the same time. The Republican Party is less of a liberal party than it used to be, but still kind of at base, since it still believes in markets, kind of a liberal party. And this incoherence around liberalism, you know, and and I think it's also maybe implied in your statement that there's a time when liberalism was coherent. I wanted to make it clear when mentioning the Jonathan Israel books that was never true. Like there was a
Yeah,
set of ideas that most of these people agreed on. They didn't even agree on whether democracy is what you needed to do it.
right,
Like if you go look at the French philosophers pre the revolution, some of them think you need enlightened despots because not because they don't think the peasants ever could be free, but they're like they're not going to be free right now. They can,
mm,
you know,
right,
they're all irreligious weirdos, and but we have faith that they will be one day, but we're going to need a like strong leader, a Caesar, to make that
mhm,
happen. And then there were those who were like, that's nuts. The Caesar's going to just take power. Like that kind of incoherence is in liberal thought from
right,
day one.
right,
Um, a Hegelian point would be that that is where the development of liberalism comes from. Like even like in this sense, I am kind of still Hegelian. I'm still like for me, the development of Marxism is as much about conflicts about the failures of Marxism um, than it is about our reaction to liberalism, although that's part of it. So when someone, for example, tries to say we should not talk about the failures of the past because it makes socialism look bad,
right,
I always go, you're freezing us in time. We cannot grow if we cannot deal with the material failures of past societies, or if you come up with just so theories like Khrushchev did it. I'm
mm,
sorry, even in a place like the United States, Trump is not going to destroy the United States. If Trump destroys the United States, it's because there were already fundamental breakages in our society of which he was able to exploit, but
right,
somebody would have exploited him even if it was in a different way.
right. Yeah, I mean, I actually wrote a like an undergrad paper about China and liberalism, and one of my points was that China is constantly appealing to essentially liberal values. Like, they don't say like they don't make this like sophisticated anti-democracy critique. They say actually no, we have real democracy. We have local democracy. We have like substantive democracy. Our people are actually represented, and they fight on those terms. And so yeah, there very much is like a strong liberal strain in China. I mean, even some of their leaders have liberalized in the sense of moving towards like our form of state and term limits and all this kind of stuff. Most recently, they've moved away from that, but they've had a big part of that in their political history. Um, but yeah, I mean,
I mean, we've moved away from it too, to be fair.
yeah,
So,
true. That's true. That is a thing. Which, yeah, I mean, what do you think? How do you interpret Trump and like the various reactions, right? Because I think a lot of people will point out the insufficiency and the hypocrisy of the Democratic Party, and I don't necessarily disagree with that. But my problem is that usually the implication of that is that Trump is like not unique, that Trump is kind of order as usual. He's just like more extreme, maybe. Whereas
mhm.
I think that it's substantively worth pointing out, whether you're a liberal or not, that Trump is anti-liberal in a way that people before him weren't. That everyone else was playing a game, and that game had contradictions, it had incoherencies, but it was a game, and Trump is against that game. That's kind of how I would put it, and I think that's worth analyzing and working with and dealing with and trying to figure out. You can't leave the conversation there, but I think people ignoring that is harmful.
I would say to you that Trump is a strong deviation in substance from late 20th century liberalism and the way even conservatives priorly have tried to maintain a fairly apolitical administrative state, not because they believed in the administrative state, but because they wanted relative social peace. Um, which was to say, you are onto something about Trump being, let's just say, a kind of malignant mutation of things that are like, if I look at any Trumpist policy, right, there are illiberal elements of liberal society that he picks up on, but when he picks up on it, he expands it. The problem that you have about, I mean, when you argue with Marxists today, is like you do have a problem with the fact that it's not just the insufficiency of the Democratic Party, it's the insufficiency of the various also apolitical institutions to deal with what happens when these norms were mutated to something else. But one thing I will say is almost everything you see in Trump, you can find in American history, but not together.
Mm.
So his policies have some Wilsonian variances. There's definitely a strong paleo-conservative streak. I will say also, of the forms of conservatism, paleo and national conservatism, and they're not quite the same thing, but they're they are unfortunate brothers in arms today in particular.
Right.
Uh, um, have not been predominant in American life since World War II. And they do represent strains of thinking that are weird amalgamations of both, broadly speaking, American, and by this I mean big A, not just the country. I mean both continents, settler, colonial
Right.
continent sort of thing, um, that have always been here. You know, the Confederate freebooters, Confederate anti-imperialism, and those are opposed movements. I mean, you look at when the Confederacy split, you have people who become diehard anti-imperialists opposed to the Mexican-American War, um, and you have people who become something else. White nationalism. White nationalism is a weird movement, and by that I mean it is an exclusive movement and a very hateful movement, but it is actually, compared to European nationalism of the 19th century, an inclusive movement. It was designed to be, which is why it caught on more in the Americas, both in the United States but also in Latin America, than it ever caught on in Europe until the 20th century. Because are you to get Germans and the British to come to common cause on their racial history, even though Gorbanal and France wanted them to do so? Not really. Um,
Yeah.
in fact, it was still a tension. Like if you looked at the far right, and you know, a lot of the people you've had on your show don't know the far right very well. I kind of do. Um, if you looked at the far right in the European New Right and the people around that before they got into Duginism,
Right.
a kind of national Bolsheviks, right wing populism, right identitarianism, Euro identitarianism movements, and you looked at Richard Spencer,
Mm.
right? Richard Spencer promoted the EU because he saw it as promoting largely a white institution against Brexit, which would have promoted immigration from the Commonwealth, which was predominantly not white. Whereas a lot of the more diehard European new nationalists were like, why would the French and Germans ever get along? We have historical reasons for hating each other. So, like, you know, this is very hard for us to parse. I think liberals in America are particularly bad at it,
Yeah.
because all of these ways of thinking are somewhat foreign to them, and they do not want to admit that even white nationalism has some inclusive core in it, as hateful and odious as it is. And I do think it's hateful and odious. I want to be very clear from that. But it caught on in the United States in particular because of the way to justify people from different to align people from different nationalities. And one of the things that you'll see today, for example, if you get into weird niche memes on the right, like you have like this weird like when did you come over grading system and what kind of European are you? And weirdly, even though that comes off as hyper Americanism, it's actually an older European way of thinking. Um, so uh, you know, what do we deal with that right now? Trump is a demagogic figure, the likes of which we have not effectively seen. I mean, Warren Harding was, you know, the same kind of person, but he was not nearly as. I would hesitate to call Trump competent in the sense of actual policy, but I do mean competent in the sense of like projecting an image that can erase distinctions. The right would be pretty much at civil war with itself if Trump was not here to paper over those differences, and you see that the moment he's not around.
Yeah.
Um, uh, so so yeah, I mean, I do think Trump is something new, but I don't think he is completely foreign from the American experience, and that tension is hard for people to wrestle with. You know, me and Danny Besner. You might know Daniel Besner of American Prestige. We agree on a lot of stuff. We're both kind of more the quote black pilled left wing. Um, but what I would say is one of the things we disagree is like Besner will be like, well, the Confederacy is the Confederacy. The fascists told from it. It's why would you call them fascist? Because they predate it. And I actually agree with that argument. But I would say, but we do have to admit that those fascistic elements were emerging and parts of liberalism in that time from illiberal stuff. Because the other thing that Marxism would say is you're never going to get rid of all the prior society in the new society,
Of
at least
course.
not for like 1,000 years. So like all these old ideas. I mean, if you want to trace like modern racialism is a modern phenomenon. Like ancient Greeks and Romans, they had concepts like race. They talk about skin color, but they talk about the xenos, and it's really driven by language. And you can kind of get dopped in. Like if you learn to speak the language and you can become a Greek.
Hmm.
You know, this idea that you were born a thing and you could never the twain shall meet is a relatively modern biological notion. But there is a straight lineage from like ideas about Christendom, particularly and then European them after the fall of Constantinople, that you can trace and see each step of the development of something like 15th, 16th century notions of race, which eventually led to what we have today with Trump. And I would say, you know, each of those things are something new, right? Gorbanau is not the Portuguese slave traders, is not the Crusades, right? Gorbanau, for those of you who don't know, is the guy who came up with biological race in France. It's where this, but like the first people to call people white were Portuguese slave traders. Ironically, in America, we didn't see the Portuguese as white, but you know, still that's where it came from.
Yeah.
And so this this development you can trace back to late medieval Christendom, but it's not the same thing. And Trump is a similar thing that like these ideas, these this kind of like shadow self of the American idea has been around as long as we've been around and before it.
Hmm.
But and it is implicit in certain policies liberals have promoted. I'm going to say that. But it is not the same. There is a way. I mean, again, this is another Hegelian point. If you change enough in 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 amount, you eventually change in kind. All right. So enough of a thing becomes a different thing. And I think that's what I would say we see with Trump. We see this like these tendencies in both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party over the past 30 years emerged in this weird demagogic figure that kind of papers over the problems of the right, but also ideologically sorts people into the right that have never been there before. Like RFK Jr. and foreign policy weirdos, and you know, some of whom I might even agree with on specific issues, but like have all been sorted now right wing. Authoritarians have all been sorted now right wing in a way that they have not been historically. Liberty, like a former compatriot of mine that I was almost going to write a book with, Michael Rettenwald, is now like pushing anti-Muslim and anti-Semitic conspiracy theories while being in the you know the Libertarian Party, which used to be historically against that stuff, because he's now like a nationalist libertarian, which has always been a weird substrate, and it was kind of implicit in Lou Rockwell and Ron Paul, if you know who those guys are.
Yep.
Um, but like, it's blatant now. This guy's also an ex-Marxist. I just, I was gonna write a book with him. Just put that out. Uh, our last interaction on Twitter was him making fun of me for not having as many followers, because peddling conspiracy theories will get you a lot of followers these days. Um, but I see that as the destruction of reason, and he sees that as a way to promote your ideas. But my point is, this is now sorted out. Like, it doesn't even make sense that the libertarians are sorted out this way. There's nothing coherent about that in libertarian ideology,
Right.
except maybe private tyranny is acceptable, but public tyranny isn't, a la Hobbes, Herb, Hop. And that's, Mencius Mollberg's like now known
Hmm.
Curtis Jarvin, Nick Land, they got that from Hans Herb Hop, and that's like an old von Mises thing. Um, but in general, most libertarians have not believed it. That was a minority viewpoint in that system. But now it's sorted. You know what happened to most of the libertarians who believed in markets? They're hanging out with resistance liberals now. Like, it sorted things in different ways. If you pretend that it's politics as usual, that sorting doesn't make sense. Now, the one complication I'll give to you is I do think a lot of Trump is implied in the crises of the 70s and Nixon, and we just forestalled it for a long
Mm.
time. But what we forestalled it with was basically non-legal norms in the Supreme Court, which was never going to be enough to keep it away forever. And now that liberals, I mean, I remember liberals telling me for years, like, we've never had progressive legislation, but we've had all these progressive rulings from even a relatively conservative court. And I'm like, yeah, but you're not going to like it when the conservatives actually finally take that over, and they will eventually. It's inevitable. Just like there will probably, if there's any American democracy left, there will probably be a time where liberals get the Supreme Court again. Are they going to do the same thing with it? Or are they going to try to reform it? It's going to be that's going to be the option for them. Another thing that we have to look at right now, if you're a liberal, are you against gerrymandering or not? Like, you might think you have to do it to survive in the short term. I'm not even saying that's not true. I actually don't know. But if you think that you're going to have a functional democracy by gerrymandering in response to everything, I hate to tell you, but the historical precedent on that's really bad.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Um, so, is Trump new? Is this situation new? Yes. Is he a development from things in the past? I would also say yes, but I would agree with you that it is something new. And I know, like, you've had Chris Cutrone on the show. He thinks that Trump is just like almost the spirit of liberalism or whatever. Like, he's a Bonapartist spirit of liberalism that's going to induce a crisis for the left. It's going to clarify what the left really means, and we're going to believe in liberal values again, and then we'll have a Marxist revolution and enable bourgeois society for real this time. That's like the postage stamp, not completely fair version of what he advocates. But that is what he advocates. I don't think that's the case. Like, I think Trump is where the congealed id of a lot of the unfortunate implications of politics as normal have gone, and that has broken American politics. Um, and I have no idea how you put that back in the bottle. I mean, you take someone like the late Charlie Kirk, right? Uh, 5 years ago, even during Trump won, he was conciliatory to Trump, but he sounded like not that different, at least on the spectrum of a Paul Ryan conservative, right? Today, he was kind of the interface man between traditional conservatism and people like Nick Fuentes and the Goipers, right? I'm not saying that is. I mean, I'm a leftist. I think that's bad, but I'm not saying like that isn't a logical progression of where that movement has gone, and him trying to stay as the interface between a kind of grassroots and non-grassroots form of that movement. That's always what he served as the function of. But the fact that that's shifted so much in a decade, that the talking points of Turning Point USA have shifted so much in a decade, and it would only do that if the money backing it was also on board with that shift because they thought it had to happen. Um, and I would also say it's organic shift in a way, for example, that certain things on Democratic parties, like about the chorus controversy with
Right.
with the 1620, And by the way, I'm not delusional. Most progressive influencers have always had backers. The idea that left doesn't have money on it's just not true. But that has not been as organic of a movement. That has been trying to get people's natural frustrations with Trump back in line with a kind of center leftist view of the Democratic Party. Um, it's not. I would say if you call it a centrist view, that's not true. You can go to the abundance crowd for that. Also backed by billionaires. But my point on that is that shows you something is changing, that even needs to exist. But that is trying to basically wag the dog, because the base of the Democratic Party is just not there anymore. Maybe they're hoping that to win some like moderate Zoomers back by that. I don't know. Whereas there's been real organic movement on the right to more and more nationalist concerns. and nativist issues that we have not seen through most of the 20th century. We
Yeah.
do see it in the 19th century, but again, like I said earlier, on this whole like when you pull something from the past, if it comes up in the future, it's going to be very different. We can't say that Trump is just 19th century ideology. What does
Right.
the AI and the tech billionaires have to do with that? Like nothing.
Yeah.
So like we do have to have a more developed answer to that. I don't know how that makes you feel or react. I mean, like I would love to get your thoughts. That I've talked a lot, but like I do think you're right. Trump is different, but I don't think he's completely foreign. And I think that's hard for like it's more of a mutation of of things that we already probably didn't want in our society, but have morphed into some new thing that rhymes with old things. I mean, I mean, like I always have said, like I don't call Trump fascist, but I will call him fascistic or brown shirt e. But there's elements of fascism that aren't there. Um, and I get tired of semantic debates about that because it just we should be responding to what we're fighting right now, and what we're fighting right now is something like fundamentally different. And to bring it back to your point about philosophy, how would I come to terms with what was different about Trump if I did not have like some kind of working philosophy of history that may not be perfect coherent, but I'm trying to make it coherent. That's what I'm striving for. And I
Hmm.
don't necessarily know that I, as an individual, can ever do that. Like, I don't know that I can be perfectly coherent, but it does seem to be a check on just like making everything whatever I fucking want it to be. Um, you know, I would love to believe, for example, that Trump would end the things I don't like about liberalism and we'd all be happily ever after in an organic state. I mean, I don't like nationalism in general, but like if nationalism really did make everybody get what they want and happy, I wouldn't oppose it,
Right.
right? But I don't think it's ever going to do that. Like I think tariffs are mostly stupid. I think I think authoritarian policing and a multi-ethnic, frankly, empire will that tries to like re-ethnicize itself is going to collapse itself. I don't think it necessarily gets filled up by anything good. And the other people are like, oh well, China will come and save. I'm like, no, they're not. I mean, like China's not interested in that. Like, why would you even assume that they would care? Like, like, there's no Comintern that's promoting international communism right now, and China's definitely not doing that. So, like, like, what do you think? What are you thinking? Like, you're on your own, and I think the hard part to be an honest liberal right now, to be fair to your liberal listeners, is that you have to look at this and go, how do I deal with this? Because on one hand, you got like both rightists and far leftists telling me that this is business as usual. On other hands, I'm seeing every single institution break down in ways that we've not seen in the 20th century. Now, I do think a lot of that actually is based in economic failures, honestly, but it's not just that. It could play out in other ways. Like there could be other ways this goes down, and I think as any kind of honest liberal today, and also for my listeners, any Marxist today, you have to figure out what you're going to do in response to this, and not just think you can role play the past. You're not going to get your FDR back. I'm not going to get my Lenin back. We have to just accept that. Like we can learn from them, we can do stuff, but that's not coming back. Time's arrow goes, it might spiral. Oh, that tripped my camera. It might spiral, but it's not going backwards. So, that's where I'm at.
Yeah.
I don't know. Where does that leave you?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I mean, I've myself have made the connection that there was kind of like a downward spiral after Nixon, that
Mm.
that was manifesting in different ways. Like once you had Reagan and the reaction to Carter and Carter's administration, every all the mistrust and the lack of like belief in the liberal values, all of that was happening. And people often connect Trump to Reagan, and they do so in like a very shallow way where they're like, well, Reagan didn't like gay people, Reagan was like right wing. And it's like no, the scary thing about Reagan was that he had people around him who were like we don't care about values anymore. We're just going to start, like, the system has failed us, so we're just going to start breaking rules. We don't care. And Reagan had people around him who were like that. And you can look at like the impeachment of Bill Clinton and things like that. Everything just became a mess. No one really believed in the system anymore. And yeah, so I think it very logically, I think Trump should be seen in that like historical context, as you said. So I completely agree with that. I guess like yeah, I mean I agree, and I also take on the 18th Brumaire criticism of liberals that you can't just look at like a scary figure who comes up and just like panic and say this guy came out of nowhere. Like you have to actually analyze history and institutions and figure out why that happened. So I take on that criticism that I think is in the 18th Brumaire. Um, and so
It
yeah, I
is.
mean
I
we're
would think that's a good reading of it. Go
yeah,
ahead.
I think we're mostly in alignment on that. Yeah, I mean, when I bring up like the uniqueness of Trump, it's not to say like, oh wow, Trump is so crazy, and I'm like throwing up my hands. I don't know what's going on. It's mostly just a counter to the like like you were mentioning a lot of the reactionary elements who might be on the left, might be otherwise, who are just kind of opportunistically aligning themselves with like the movement of history, and they're not dealing with that. So yeah, I think we ultimately we have to do something, which I guess leads me to my last question, which would be: you said that you're kind of on the black pill, the doomer left. So what is that? What do you how do you think about that? Like, do you think like are there moments where you're just like I have no idea what to do, or are there like steps that you would want to take or that you believe in taking to do something about that, or what do you think is the possible like yeah how does that actually work out?
Well, one thing I've thought a lot about is what we mean by revolution and the fetishization of insurrection as revolution in a time period where you have drones, nuclear weapons, total surveillance state. The other thing I've thought a lot about is what I mentioned is like the fact that when rage relations are like not universal, but kind of close. I mean, you like 70-80% of society, but like the industrial part of the proletariat that everyone recognizes, right? It's only like 15% of the
Right.
population, right? What do you do with that? And because the things that left wingers fetishize, and I believe, like I'm a union guy, like I work in unions, but I'm also going to tell you, like everything that we have done in unions in the middle 20th century is not going to work. It's not going to work now. Like
Mm.
the structure of work is too different. So
Yeah.
how do we change that? That's hard to do because a lot of that early 20th century stuff is codified in law. So so I always sound like I'm a doomer because I'm like, you can't really do this, you can't really do this. You're not gonna have like it's gonna be hard to reform the Democratic Party, and people think that's because I like, oh, I think that Bernie Sanders or Zoran Mamdani, I have trouble with that MN thing. I want to pronounce his name right. Um, and all those people are somehow bad faith actors. I don't think that actually. I mean, like I kind of think AOC might be, but like I don't think that in general. That's not relevant to me. Whether they are, they aren't. My point is, you can't protect them. Other people can. The people who can't protect them can also discipline them by denying that protection
Hmm.
or that money or whatever. And so it is rational for them to be, even if they have policy objectives that are left wing, to defer to that to get some of that done. Um, it also means that your entire agenda is fucked. So how do you get past that? And why? While I'll sometimes I don't think I'm actually black pill. People accuse me of that. But what I'll say is like most of the things people want to do in the United States on the far left and even in the liberal left. I'm not going to speak so much to the liberal center right now. Is long term not possible. Okay, like we want a mass party, all right, a mass workers party. I want to tell people like the workers' parties in Europe have not gone as far as the Democrats have gone towards neoliberalism and stuff, but they've all gone there. Like it is delusional to think they haven't.
Hmm.
The party the communist parties of the developing world as that's developed have liberalized, and some of them have forced other communist parties to liberalize, like uh, China's trade deals with Cuba forced a liberalization that almost caused a crisis in 2020 that people thought was anti-communist, and it kind of was, but also it also kind of was they're mad about market liberalizations that happened in Cuba in 2020 around COVID. Um, I was in Egypt when deals with China caused them to free float their currency, which caused a crisis, a major crisis. Like the currency became almost valueless overnight. It was a hyperinflation crisis. Um, and then a deflation crisis afterwards that just totally screwed everything up. Um, and that was not just imposed by the IMF, right?
Right.
So I tell people this because I think a lot of people have real delusions about what you can do to change the world now. And always like you have to build up new social structures. Like I'm one of these people who thinks, for example, that the U.S. Constitution has illiberal elements to it that have become more and more and more the dominant parts of the Constitution, and liberal elements have become less and less salient. Um, and Despite the myth in America that we're a young country, as a state, as a physical state, we
Right.
are older than Germany and Italy and most of Europe. We're not older than
Right.
France, we're not older than the UK, but we are older than most of the EU member states
Right.
as states, not as cultures so much. Although even that like is a little bit of nationalist mythology building
Right.
over there in Europe, but as states we are, and we have a very minimally amended constitution. The problem is now there's no social trust to like how would you even go about that?
Yeah.
Everyone thinks that like you have a constitutional convention, we're almost immediately at civil war. Um,
Yeah.
so I am black pilled on the sense that I think a lot of people's radical action that they conceive of it right now is LARPing. But I'm also hopeful about that because the one thing I'll say to people, this is also from the Vermeer. He always says, the change always presents itself in the costume of the past,
Mm.
right? Basically, everyone's LARPing until they're not.
Right.
Um, but one of the other things that has really gotten to me, and you've kind of hinted at this, okay, is that people will present pure ideologies on the internet for people to pick up like almost consumer style, but they can't live them.
Right.
Like, and if you talk about people critiquing philosophy, like, okay, we critique philosophy, but let's replace it with critical theory, right? But for a lot of people, the critical theory is even more removed from reality than like traditional discussion of like logical parsing or categories, right? So, like, what am I building? Where I'm building something that people can believe in, but they can't enact, they can't embody, they can't do. They can't, and I realize there's a problem. Like all communists, so we can't know what communism is until it happens, But I'm like, there's nothing we can give them to do right now. Like I tell you, for example, um, you want to end the massacre and genocide in Gaza. Okay, you want to do that, right? What are you going to do about it? Like what are you really going to do about it? Because you can't even stop. Like
Yeah.
maybe you can put pressure on your state to stop sending them money. That will have a dramatic effect on the Israeli war machine. It would change geopolitics. But you know what it wouldn't necessarily do? End a state that already has 28 nuclear weapons from being able to do largely what they want to a domestic population without risking global nuclear war.
Right.
So, maybe they'd run out of munitions. It'd be hard for them to create. I don't know. Maybe that would be the real limit, but so would the other side. I mean, people have committed genocides with effectively sticks in the past. So I don't really know if that would do what people think it would do. When I support people doing it, absolutely. I don't think we should giving a dime to that war effort at all. But so I don't want people to think that I'm saying that that's not what we should be advocating for. But also in America right now, what, how much of foreign policy is democratically sorted?
Mm-hmm.
Very little.
Yeah.
And so it's just to me like, okay, so what are we going to do about it? Like, really, what are we going to do about it? Not what we're going to ask for people to do for us, not, you know, and so I say this because I'm like, okay, now that you have this knowledge, let's say you learn about all this horrible stuff around Zionism, um, and honestly, the Zionists haven't been hiding it this time, except kind of, sort of, really, and the response to that have just even made like honestly, anti-Semitism doesn't even mean anything anymore. Like trying to explain to someone what it might mean is nearly impossible. Um, So you're in this world. You want to end that. The question is, like, I okay, so you believe in this, you believe this bad thing is happening. What are you going to do about it? And I think political action does have to have things you can do, not just things you can believe. And I see a lot of people right now believing stuff and not doing things. And when people do stuff, it's basically voting or stochastic violence.
Yep.
That's it.
Yeah.
Like, it's not organized. You know, like, I'm not going to lie to people. All politics involves violence in some way. The state is a violent actor by necessity and definition. But like unorganized political violence, what has it done historically? Like,
Yeah.
it changes history, but rarely in the way that anyone who did it predicts. You know, there's a reason why Lenin had this long thing about not doing individual terrorism. Like, and you know, these were not people who were anti-terror, by the way. I tend to be pretty anti-terror because I think you can't control it. I think you end up killing, like, maybe I've been accused of being liberal for this because I think, like, oh, you unleash violent social forces and just let them rip. You're gonna like rip people apart, and then you have no social subject to do shit with. Why would I ever want to do that? I don't want people killing their ex girlfriends. You know, in a unleash of social revenge. It doesn't even have anything to do like with what we're actually aiming for. That doesn't seem, and that did happen in the Yuzovchina, the purges in 1930. I sorry, I use the Russian term sometimes. The purges are in the Red Terror. That's why that's why Lenin stopped the Red Terror in 1921. Even though they entered a civil war immediately after. You know, or like what the Mountain, the Jacobins did to the Vendée in um in Europe. And but I'll also say, like, we always talk about this, you know, there is a truth to the fact that like the French Revolution actually ended up killing less people than the American Revolution and Civil War did as percentages of the population. And the reason why that is both the American Revolution and the Civil War are civil wars, and civil wars are necessarily more bloody than other forms of conflict because they're zero sum. You can't like retreat back to your home country and just decide you're not going to do it anymore because, you know, you've killed three of them and they've killed one of you, but you have somewhere else to go, and so you
Right.
just give up, which is the normal strategic logic, right? That's not going to happen in the Civil War. You know, and here's the thing: the American Civil War was less bloody than most because it was regionally divided in a clear way that had delimited battle lines. If you look at like the Taiping Rebellion, that killed 10% of China, right? The American Civil War killed 2%. And that was the most bloody war we've ever had. Like, so when I say this because when a lot of you see a lot of leftists talk about, well, we need revolution and insurrection, and I'm like, so you're basically answering for civil war, and you're also calling for purges and violent revenge on, like, I don't know, 30% of society. How do you think that's going to go for you? What are you going to build? What
Yeah.
class of society are you going to build on top of fucking bones? So, like, on that sense, I sound pretty black pilled because I'm just like that. You know, politics does involve violence, but that's absurd.
Yeah.
Stochastic violence is absurd. And I'm going to also say voting under the current contract without building other institutions, even if you're a liberal, all right? Even if you're a liberal, not even if you're a Marxist. If you don't have counter institutions to defeat like these billionaires who have to protect these politicians, you don't have anything. And so, since I don't see anyone building that, and I see people building boutique ideologies for people, which I actually think don't pull, they what I like to call pseudo politicized people. They make people think their belief is a political action rather than actually participating in political action is a political action. Um, and that joining small online groups of niche figures like you would fandoms is somehow a political action. I think that's a disaster. Like, I really do. And that's kind of blackpilled me because I don't see an easy way out of that right now. I don't think we could just say, let's have a mass party. You know what it took to build a mass party in the early 20th century? It took three generations of wars and failed governments from 1848 on.
Yeah.
Like, the amount and the percentage of populations dying, 5, 10, 15%, like, that's not something the modern mind even comprehends. All right. You know, like, I think we couldn't even comprehend COVID,
Hmm.
really.
Yeah.
Like 1 million people died. Most Americans don't like. We never mourned that. We never dealt with that. Um, people are like, oh, where did everyone go? I'm like, well, we lost 1 million people, but that's still a relatively small percent of a 320 million person population, right? You start looking at 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10% of your population dying. I don't think current society would survive that. I really don't. We aren't that kind of people. We have not grown up exposed to that kind of violence.
Yeah.
And our potential to do that kind of violence is much higher. Um, and so, yeah, that's pretty blackpilling. I don't know what else to tell you. Um,
Yeah.
but I guess that's why, like, I've always been somewhat sympathetic to people like Matt McManus, even though I think Marxism is a different thing than at this point than liberalism. But I've always been like, we do have to see what common values we have because on some level, I want a classless society, and I do think that will mean violence. But no, I do not think I can literally get rid of everyone who would not want that from society because that would be killing 30-40% of the population. Societies don't survive that. And if you're talking about that on a worldwide scale, you're literally talking about like civil war worldwide on a level that no one's comprehended before. And I don't know that I think that could be a species ending event, particularly when you tie it to climate change, you tie it to um, environmental degradation, you tie it to production problems, and you just hit all that together. And I don't know what you do. And that is pretty blackpilling. I don't know that we're there yet, but the thing is, I think I don't see exactly how we build those institutions anymore. My hope is in reinvigorating union movements, we could start building institutions around that would be viable beyond traditional unions for dealing with this. But that's going to meet opposition from everybody. And I don't think people have really processed all that could mean. Um, and the other thing I'll say is I've lived in North Africa and Mexico. I lived in Mexico during the Sede Sinaloa Cartel War, and I lived in North Africa and Egypt during the counter revolution of the Arab Spring, the ending of the Arab Spring, effectively. Um, that and I can tell you, in historical terms, that was a relatively low scale of violence, and I still don't think many Americans can comprehend some of the shit I saw. That is nothing compared to like what happened in Latin America in the 1980s or anything like that.
Right.
Um, and so watching people talk about political violence so casually with no comprehension of what it means, um, that's pretty fucking blackpilling because the people who talked about this in the 19th century actually did have an understanding of what they were talking about. They had seen wars and the beginnings of mechanized wars that they had not seen priorly. That was part of the radicalizing events.
Right.
The beginning of the locomotive, the beginning of rifling becoming really reliable, of automatic weapons, of gas bombs and stuff like that. The industrialization of war. We think of that with World War I, but that really began in the middle of the. I mean, the U.S. Civil War, the Franco-Prussian War, really saw a lot of that. And then, like I said, there were wars in the 19th century. I don't know why we call the Taiping Rebellion a rebellion. It was really a civil war, where you didn't even have that, and you still killed 10% of the population. Um, the level of violence is really hard to comprehend, particularly when we're also dealing with modern population scales, because these are not like 19th century is not modern population scales.
Right.
So like it's I don't think the human mind can I don't think any human mind can totally wrap their head around it, but I can tell you like I have PTSD now from just seeing little bits of it. And so that makes me really hesitant for all this talk of political violence amongst radical movements because on one hand I think political violence is a fact of the world. Um one of the reasons why I believe in a classless society is I hope one day we live in a world without that much political violence.
Right.
It would just be like to normal violence. um, but on the other hand, we are very liberalism systematizes, normalizes, and um, the rule of law does a lot in liberalism to limit. It doesn't make unnecessary. It doesn't do away with political violence. We still have political prisoners. We have all that. That's all still very real. But it does prevent a lot of it. That's why even non-liberal ideologies have adopted liberal norms of rule of law because, frankly, the violence risk is too high. Um, and a lot of those countries learned that the hard way.
Yeah.
So I do worry about what this post-liberal world is with people who are constantly exposed to violence in abstract, never exposed to violence in person, are relatively rarely exposed to it, and then don't know how to deal with what it means. But I think that's coming, and I'm not predicting we're gonna have a civil war. I'm not, we may not. I have no idea. Um, but I just think like we are going to live in a more politically violent world relatively soon if things don't change, and I don't know how they change. And also, I'm not sure the old order. What I mean, like, if you were not in the core of the old order, it was also pretty fucking violent. It's just it was hidden from us, and I don't really want to go back and be like, oh yeah, we should kick the shit out of brown people to maintain our illusion of this. I don't have an easy answer for any of that, and that is pretty blackpilling.
Yeah. All right. Well, on that optimistic note of hope and wonder, yeah, I really appreciate you coming on. Yeah, I really appreciate you coming on. It was good talking to you and hearing what you think about philosophy and Marxism and the contemporary environment. And yeah, thank you everyone for watching. And check out Derick Varn if you, I mean, I'm sure pretty much everyone here knows, but in case you haven't, check out his show. And yeah, thank you.